There are stories buried beneath the red earth of the South, stories of power twisted into obsession, and of crimes that history chose to forget. When most people imagine the brutality of slavery, they picture the lash, the auction block, and the white master's cruelty. But one truth remains almost completely erased: the hidden violence carried out by white women who wielded power inside the household. This is not a tale of forbidden love. It is a record of domination, of people who used proximity and privilege to control the bodies and dignity of the enslaved men who served them. The plantation was more than a field of forced labor. It was a theater of constant surveillance. Every corner, every corridor was governed by hierarchy. White men enforced it through law and violence. White women maintained it through the intimate spaces of daily life. Pilgrim paintings and novels, those women were portrayed as delicate figures, draped in lace, holding parasols, symbols of purity in a brutal world. But beneath that performance of innocence lay something far more complex. They ruled kitchens, nurseries, and sick rooms. They ordered punishments, rationed food, and decided who would enter or leave the house. Inside those private domains, power had no witnesses. In a world where white men ruled by law, one historian writes, white women ruled by proximity. Their power was quieter, but no less devastating. An order, a rumor, a single accusation could destroy a life. For the enslaved men who worked within those homes, valets, drivers, carpenters, stable hands, every glance could carry danger. To live under such rule was to live in constant fear of misinterpretation. A word spoken too directly, an expression read the wrong way, could invite punishment, or worse. The same society that proclaimed white womanhood to be sacred gave those women unchecked authority over people who have no legal rights, no voice, and no protection. The contradiction is staggering. A culture that celebrated purity used it as camouflage for control. A myth built to protect white femininity also shielded cruelty from scrutiny. The domestic world of the plantation became an extension of slavery's violence. Was that beneath the image of the Southern belle lay another reality, a woman who, in the shadows of her home, could become both enforcer and oppressor. What happens when the symbol of innocence becomes an instrument of control? Crimson haunts every surviving page of history's record. It is the 18th and 19th centuries. The American South stands tall on its stolen wealth, grand plantations stretching for miles, mansions with white columns gleaming in the sun, built on a foundation of human misery. To the outside world, these estates symbolized refinement, civility, and faith. But for the people who labored unseen in the fields and the kitchens, they were prisons of the mind and body. Dismissed inside those grand homes, life pulsed with contradictions. White men governed the laws of ownership, politics, and punishment. But within the domestic world, the household itself, it was white women who reigned. They managed food, clothing, and discipline. They oversaw the servants, supervised births, and even dictated the rhythm of the enslaved people's daily existence. This domestic authority was both a reflection of their confinement and the weapon against those beneath them. Publicly, they were portrayed as delicate and dependent, women needing protection. Privately, many commanded with an iron will. The myth of fragility concealed a network of absolute control. Imagine an enslaved man serving in such a house, forced to keep his head low, to obey every order, to remain silent even when his dignity was under siege. The power dynamic was suffocating. One wrong movement, one perceived disrespect could invite unspeakable retribution. Southern ideal of femininity demanded that white women embody moral virtue. But beneath the lace and prayer books, power was intoxicating, and it demanded expression. When denied independence by their husbands and fathers, many redirected that thirst for control toward those they could dominate completely. Enslaved men became unwilling participants in that transfer of power. White women could not vote, could not hold office, and were bound by patriarchal law. But in the plantation home, they ruled the immediate lives of dozens, sometimes hundreds of enslaved people. They gave and withheld food. They punished with humiliating domination. To protect their families, to refuse commands, or even to assert the most basic autonomy. Their bodies, like those of enslaved women, were not their own. Every interaction, every moment was shaped by survival. And so behind the illusion of Southern gentility, a darker reality took form, one in which those draped in white dresses could enforce terror as effectively as any overseer with a whip. Their power was quiet, domestic, and devastating. Society refused to see it. The image of the pure Southern lady was too important, too profitable, too sacred to challenge. Artists painted them as angels of the household. Writers called them the heart of civilization. No one wanted to believe that beneath the silks and manners was cruelty, deliberate, rehearsed, and masked by the language of grace. Yet those who lived under their rule knew better. They saw the coldness in the eyes behind the smiles. They heard the clipped tone that preceded punishment. They knew that the walls of the big house were lined not only with portraits and chandeliers, but with secrets, the kind that could destroy lives if spoken aloud. And when the lights dimmed and the house fell quiet, the power dynamics twisted into something even more sinister. The myth of fragility cracked, revealing the raw force of control beneath it. Because power, once granted without accountability, always finds its darkest expression in the shadows. What began as household management became domination. What was called duty became cruelty. And what history later romanticized as Southern grace was often built on fear. But how did this carefully polished innocence, this illusion of gentility, transform into something far more disturbing? The plantation was more than a field of labor. It was a machine of psychological control, perfected over generations. Every sound, every ritual, every rule served one purpose: to remind the enslaved that they were owned, that their lives, their choices, their bodies, even their memories, belonged to someone else. From sunrise to sunset, black men worked the fields. They're reinterpreted as defiance. Public punishment became a ritual performance. It wasn't just about control, it was about humiliation, to remind the entire community that no resistance, no dignity, no sense of self could survive under the white gaze. Every lash, every punishment was a message. Your body is not yours. Your pain belongs to us. White men ruled with the whip, but white women ruled with proximity, with the constant, intimate authority of the household. They managed the interiors of the plantation's cruelty, determining who was sent where, who was favored, who was starved, and who was punished. Their power was often invisible, but it reached deep into the bones of those they controlled. When fear and domination become routine, they create an emotional numbness, a cold efficiency of cruelty. But when that numbness collides with desire, when power begins to disguise itself as attention, the result is something darker, a manipulation of both the mind and the flesh. Simmons' society taught white women that they were pure, untouchable, above temptation, yet they lived in daily proximity to enslaved men, men who represented everything society both condemned and coveted. The contradiction was unbearable, and in that tension between fear and fascination emerged acts of violation masked as control. But these were not crimes of passion. They were calculated assertions of power. The same system that allowed white men to abuse enslaved women also allowed white women to enforce their dominance in the only domain available to them, the household. And so control found new forms. Orders became coercion, commands became torment, and silence became the price of survival. This is the part history rarely tells, that the plantation was not simply a landscape of forced labor, but of ritualized degradation. The architecture itself reflected hierarchy. The fields stretched far, but the true terror resided in the small closed spaces of the home. Bedrooms, kitchens, storage rooms, every corner could become a site of domination. It was a world designed to erase boundaries. Every act of violence, every intrusion into personal space reinforced the same message, passed down through stories too painful to tell. White society found comfort in half-truths. It was easier to imagine that brutality was confined to the fields, that violence was something masculine, external, and public. To admit the full reality, that it invaded the domestic world, that women participated in it, that it hid behind gentility, was unthinkable. But unthinkable does not mean untrue. And the deeper we look, the more we find evidence in letters, diaries, and testimonies that power does not depend on strength. It depends on silence. And silence in the South was the most carefully cultivated crop of all. As one survivor later told his interviewer, "You could be whipped for speaking. You could be whipped for not speaking. The safest thing was to say nothing." That nothing became the language of survival, but it was also the cloak that hid generations of crimes. History often describes slavery as a system of ownership, but at its core, it was a system of erasure, erasure of self, of dignity, of memory. The enslaved were not just robbed of freedom, they were robbed of their right to define what had happened to them. And when the people who controlled their bodies also controlled their stories, even the truth itself became property.